The following episode features a historic article from the Nebraska History magazine. This article may reflect the language and attitudes of its time, and while it offers valuable insight into the past, may contain expressions or viewpoints that are outdated or offensive by today's standards. Any outdated terms do not reflect the current views or perspectives of the Nebraska State Historical Society. Welcome to the Nebraska History Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Goforth. Each episode, we explore articles written and published in Nebraska History magazine. In July 1862, a noisy, smoke-belching machine known as the Prairie Motor rolled into Nebraska City. Though its journey lasted only 3 miles before its fateful breakdown, its legacy would reshape the trails of the American West. On today's episode, we discover the story behind this 10-ton vehicle from the 1998 Nebraska History magazine article, Nebraska City's Steam Wagon, written by William E. Lass. Monday, July 14th, 1862, was a memorable day in the history of Nebraska City, Nebraska, the Missouri River port, which was then the nation's leading overland freighting center. When a steamboat arrived from downstream St. Joseph, Missouri, it carried on its deck a massive steam wagon. This noisy, smoke-belching machine was immediately run off the boat under its own power and steered about a mile northwestward from the levee across a rock ford on South Table Creek and up the 6th Street Hill to the town center. As the first self-propelled vehicle in Nebraska, which at the time was immersed with talk about the planned transcontinental railroad, the steam wagon, or Prairie Motor, as it was dubbed by the local press, attracted throngs of curious spectators who were delighted by its shrill whistle. The imposing machine, which weighed about 10 tons when its 472.5-gallon water tank was full, was powered by 4 10-horsepower oscillating engines and had rear wheels 10 feet 2 inches in diameter with rims 18 inches wide and front wheels with a diameter of 6 feet. The water tank comprised most of its length, with upright boilers at the rear. The steering wheel, which was similar to that used on steamboats, was near the front, ahead of the furnace. Accompanying the steam wagon on its long trip from New York City was a party of 5 men led by its proprietor, Joseph Renshaw Brown of Minnesota. The 3 men who drove the wagon were experienced railroad locomotive engineers David L. Osborne and Charles B. Sloat, along with James Lawrence, the fireman. They all had worked previously for John A. Reed, the machine's builder. The 5th man was Daniel Dangerfield, a black male nurse who was brought along to care for the 57-year-old Brown, who was suffering from erysipelas, a painful, infectious skin rash. Although Brown was always somewhat of a mystery man in Nebraska City, he was a celebrity in Minnesota where he had played a major role in the region's development. Brown entered Minnesota in 1820. As a 15-year-old Army musician at Fort Snelling, which had been established as the nation's northwesternmost military post only a year before. After achieving the rank of sergeant, he left the Army in 1825 to pursue the fur trade. While trading, he earned the distinction of being Minnesota's first wheat farmer and first exporter of log rafts. In 1840, he was instrumental in organizing St. Croix County, Wisconsin Territory, which as the first governmental unit in later Minnesota included all of the land between the St. Croix and Mississippi rivers. As the first representative from St. Croix County in the Wisconsin Territory legislature, Brown succeeded in having his claim in Tacota, present-day Stillwater, named the county seat. As a power in Democratic Party politics, Brown dominated the Stillwater Convention in 1848, the meeting that stimulated the organization of Minnesota Territory the next year. During the brief territorial period of 1849 to 1858, he served as the first clerk of the House of Representatives, a member of the council, and as territorial printer. He was generally credited with having led the way in codifying the territory's laws and in writing numerous important bills. Almost frenetically active, outside of the legislature, he edited the St. Paul Pioneer, the territory's major Democratic newspaper, founded the community of Henderson in the newly opened Minnesota River Valley, and while serving as the agent to the Dakota Indians, plotted to develop Dakota Territory with its capital at Sioux Falls and to connect Minnesota and South Pass on the Oregon-California Trail by a northern route. With a reputation for connivance, Brown, who was commonly called Joe the Juggler, was a frequent target of Republican critics who saw him as the best symbol of the old conservative Democratic Party. Although critics thought he was unscrupulous, Brown was also seen by contemporaries as hardworking, enterprising, thoughtful, and extremely intelligent. His last major public role underscored his importance. In 1857, while representing the Henderson area in Minnesota's highly contentious Constitutional Convention, he served on the committee that produced the final agreement on the state's constitution. After his close friend and former fellow fur trader Henry Hastings Sibley was chosen as the state's first governor, Brown was named a major general in the state's militia. Despite his impressive background, Brown was almost universally regarded as a gadfly whose flitting from venture to venture precluded him from major financial successes. To friends and critics alike, the best evidence of his impractical side was his dream of revolutionizing overland transportation by using steam wagons. While the Prairie Motor was new to Nebraska citizens, it was actually the second steam-powered vehicle financed by Brown. Among his Henderson activities, Brown, in 1856, started the Democrat, a typical boosterish frontier newspaper. Probably because of his newspaper career, Brown became acquainted with the Scientific American, a magazine devoted to promoting technology. It regularly carried reports about experiments with steam carriages and other vehicles in both England and the United States. Brown was certainly aware of this new technology by 1859, when the Hudson's Bay Company rerouted its freight shipments to Fort Garry, present-day Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, from the Hudson Bay route through the Great Lakes and St. Paul. Seeing an opportunity to participate in this business by replacing the traditionally used Red River carts with a steam wagon, Brown negotiated with Reed to have such a machine built in New York. Brown paid Reed $4,000 to make the wagon, which was shipped partially assembled as far as Red Wing, Minnesota, on the Mississippi in 1859. It was finally unloaded from the steamboat Aeolian at Henderson on May 19, 1860. Reed and Sloat traveled to Henderson to repair some broken and bent parts and completely assemble and then test the wagon, whose wheels had a unique tricycle-like arrangement with two rear driving wheels 8 feet in diameter and a 3-foot diameter front steering wheel. The driving wheels appeared to be wheels within wheels because the actual 6-foot diameter driving wheel was connected by cogwheels and spokes to a broad metal rim 1.5 feet wide that was intended to provide a firm surface so the geared wheel would never directly touch the ground. Assisted by Beers Johnstone, a mechanic in Brown's employment, Reed and Sloat made the wagon's inaugural run on July 4, 1860. As part of Henderson's Independence Day celebration, it chugged up and down Main Street, carrying eager passengers to the loud cheers of a watchful crowd. While this performance seemed to satisfy many observers who were apparently willing to bet that it would not move at all, it did not satisfy Brown, Reed, or Sloat because it moved too slowly. After weeks of work adjusting the gears, Reed and Sloat finally were able to achieve a speed of about 2.5 miles per hour, about that of a mule-drawn wagon, and only slightly faster than ox-drawn freight wagons. In the meantime, Brown, who had failed in his effort to transport Hudson's Bay Company goods, decided to send the wagon to Fort Ridgely, about 40 miles west. In tests, the machine was navigated up Fort Hill, the long incline leading from River Bottom Henderson to the prairie that stretched off to the west. Finally, in October, Mazomanie, christened by Brown with a Dakota Indian name meaning walking iron, was started for the fort with Johnstone in charge. After 28 frustrating days, replete with the necessity of building plank roads across sloughs, Johnstone and the machine, less a towed wagon that had to be abandoned in a mud hole, reached a creek about 4 miles east of Fort Ridgely. There, the iron monster bogged down on the eve of the season's first heavy snow that drifted it in for the winter. It was still there when Brown arrived in Nebraska City with his second wagon. After their dismal experience with Mazomanie, Brown and Reed concluded that their second wagon should be faster, lighter, and have 4 wheels with the rear driving wheels running directly on the ground. According to Brown, the Nebraska City machine could move at 4.5 miles per hour, but in Nebraska City, it was reported to have speeded up to about 8 miles per hour down steep Main Street, present-day Central Avenue. The Nebraska City wagon purportedly had been tested successfully on hills in New Jersey before being shipped intact from New York City. Osborne recalled that it created a sensation in New York City where its noisy run from the factory to the railroad depot frightened horses and caused the mayor to ban any further daytime movement with it. Its 5-week passage from New York City to Nebraska City was by rail to Quincy, Illinois, and on Mississippi by way of Elizabeth, New Jersey, Harrisburg, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, then Chicago. From Quincy, it was carried by steamboat to Hannibal, and from there across Missouri on the Hannibal and St. Joseph Railroad. Brown's total cost to his arrival in Nebraska City, including $5,950 for the wagon's construction, were $7,583.62. Recognizing the need to curry public favor, the congenial Brown grandly put on a steam wagon show for delighted Nebraska Cityans. To demonstrate the newly repainted wagon's capability, Osborne, Sloat, and Lawrence ran it across South Table Creek to Kearney Heights, the hilliest part of Nebraska City. After ascending Kearney Hill, present-day Kearney Park, they maneuvered the machine through unbroken prairie sod and brush copses for about half a mile. Later, with the stars and stripes fluttering above the steam wagon, they gave rides around town to men, women, and children in towed wagons. A good time was had by all, with the possible exception of David J. Goff, whose straw hat was set on fire by a spark from the smokestack. After the rides, Brown, his crew, and some Nebraska City's principal citizens celebrated with a banquet in the Seymour House amidst animated conversation about the wagon's pending trip to Denver. Although neither Brown nor his steam wagon had really proven themselves in Nebraska City, they were enthusiastically supported by the town's 2 newspapers, the Democratic organ, The News, and the Republicans' People's Press, which usually had difficulty agreeing on anything beyond the time of day. In Brown, the editors, who had led the way in ballyhooing Nebraska City's superiority as a Great Plains shipping point, saw a new opportunity to promote their town's advantages. They had traditionally advocated improvement of their town's much-proclaimed Great Central Airline route to Fort Kearney on the Oregon-California Trail, which was within 1.5 miles of being due west of Nebraska City. Trail improvements was important to overland freighters, merchants, and settlers between Nebraska City and the western edge of the settlement at Salt Creek near present-day Lincoln. They correctly sensed that Brown's monstrous steam wagon would require a good road. Beyond the immediate goal of trail improvement, the editors naturally recognized that the Nebraska community that became the starting point of the projected Union Pacific Railroad would become the regional metropolis. When Brown appeared in Nebraska City, the railroad had been authorized, but its eastern terminus had not yet been fixed. Thus, Brown was promoted as an endorsee of the proclaimed superiority of the Nebraska City route west. Brown, as a veteran journalist and politician, was certainly no stranger to promotion whose half-truths and deceptions played on wishful thinking. To Nebraska Cityans, he was General Brown. He apparently liked the sound of the title. It is somewhat strange that with his numerous accomplishments, he chose to be recognized by his rank in the Minnesota militia, but during the Civil War, the title of general sounded important, especially without any accompanying explanation of Brown's real status. As portrayed in the Nebraska City newspapers, General Brown's sagacity in choosing the Great Central Airline route for his steam wagon's run to Denver proved that it was the best possible one for the Union Pacific. Despite the near euphoria about Brown's pending great adventure, both newspapers tried to temper expectations. The People's Press cautioned that a quick passage to the Rockies was unlikely because Brown was undertaking a trial trip to establish water and fuel stations and improve stream crossings. Subsequent trips with lighter wagons, the editor opined, would reach Denver from Nebraska City in only about 4 days. Hedging its bets, the News advised the citizenry to take the long-range view by suggesting, quote, "The present machine may not be entirely successful. If it is not, its failure will not only prove the system a failure, It will instead demonstrate the problem of what is wanted to make it successful and lead to the adoption of new applications of the principle involved, end quote. By the time the steam wagon expedition set out for distant Denver on July 22nd, the venture had really become a community enterprise. Joseph S. Phoebus recalled that the merchants of Nebraska City vowed to show their support for the undertaking, that sending their best men and their wagons along. Phoebus, hired by Robert Hawk, a prominent merchant and freighter, even had the opportunity of briefly steering the steam wagon. The excitement over the wagon's pending run carried along the trail all the way to Denver, where veteran freighter Eugene Munn recalled that the wagon's anticipated arrival was the most popular topic of conversation. Along the trail, Munn and other freighters feared the puffing contraption would spook their animals. Munn need not worry. The wagon's trip fell far short of expectations. When Osborne steered the wagon out of downtown Nebraska City, it was pulling 3 wagons. The largest was used as tender, and the other 2 were loaded with a total of perhaps 4 tons of flour. Soon, Osborne and his crew were troubled by foamy water being ejected from the boiler into the engines before it could be converted into steam. Reed later estimated that this problem reduced the wagon's power by at least half. As Osborne guided the wagon past the northwest corner of J. Sterling Morton's farm, Arbor Lodge, and out along the freighting road, it was unable to pull its train up the relatively gentle inclines. He was forced to run the steam wagon alone to the tops or downsides of slopes and then pull the wagons up with a long rope. This procedure certainly did not bode well for reaching Denver any faster than ordinary wagon trains, which usually took about 5 weeks. The steam wagon's struggles ended abruptly when a crank on one of the engines broke only about 3 miles west of Morton's farm, which, in turn, was about a mile northwest of downtown. Without local repair facilities, Brown knew immediately that he had to have the part fixed by Reed in New York City. He was careful, however, not to rush quickly out of town. First, he had to secure vital community support. Town leaders, apparently undaunted by the breakdown, organized a community meeting on July 27th, 5 days after the wagon was halted. General Isaac Coe, the district commander of the Nebraska militia and the partner of a leading freighting company, took charge. After he called the meeting to order, John H. Croxton, a territorial legislator and the attorney for Nebraska City, was elected chairman. The unspecified number of people attending the mass meeting expressed their satisfaction with the demonstrated performance of the steam wagon and affirmed their belief that it would bring their town within 3 days' travel of Denver, about 535 miles away. Believing that Brown's plans would, quote, prove to be a great blessing to the traveling community and of untold advantage to the territory, end quote, they unanimously approved a resolution asking that Otoe County Commissioners authorize the building of a public road to the county's western boundary. Brown, for his part, was expected to establish a regular steam wagon service to Denver, which would entail the building of an additional wagon. Before leaving Nebraska City, Brown regaled his audience with a detailed plan of future steam wagon service that far exceeded the community's expectations. He would not only build an additional wagon, he promised, but he would in fact have 6 new ones built and also have the Nebraska City wagon repaired as well as renovated and move overland the abandoned Minnesota wagon. Brown intended to deliver the first new wagon to Nebraska City in October of 1862 and the second 2 months later, with the 6th and last to arrive in April of 1863. Brown pledged to provide wintertime transportation in 1862 and 63 with the first 2 new wagons. Once his complete fleet of 8 wagons was on hand, he said he would regularly run the 6 new wagons between Nebraska City and the mouth of the Cache-la-Poudre River, only 35 miles from Denver, with the 2 old wagons providing Cache-la-Poudre Denver service. Brown's projections were predicated on the assumption that he would be successfully organizing a steam wagon company that would attract major investors and show a profit of $300,000 by June 30th, 1863. He estimated the company's freight business to that time at 1,200 tons, the equivalent of 600 ox-drawn wagons, and not quite one-third of Nebraska City's annual business. The outpouring of community support and Brown's optimism about future business proved that the steam wagon's short, abortive run was not seen as a failure, but rather a great success. The astute Brown evidently realized that all he had to do in Nebraska City was demonstrate his wagon. Despite his self-promotion, it is quite unlikely that Brown ever intended to run the wagon all the way to Denver. He obviously knew that it was too heavy and lacked power. Furthermore, he had not established wood and water stations along the trail. With a machine that consumed a quart of wood every 4 hours, even with the towed fuel tender, he would have required extensive stockpiles. Nebraska Cityans, well acquainted with the problems of trail life, knew there was but scant limber in the 130-mile stretch from Salt Creek to Fort Kearney. As for water, Brown's engineers, who had much difficulty generating power in using the muddy waters of the Missouri, could hardly have seen better prospects in either the Platte River or the alkali-laden ponds west of Fort Kearney. Obviously, in order for the wagon to proceed in a timely fashion, it would have been necessary to have numerous water tanks along the trail, because the wagon's tank had to be refilled after only about 3.5 to 4 hours of operation. Interestingly, in the plan that Brown elaborated after the mass meeting, he meticulously showed estimated costs for wood and water tanks. Leaving Nebraska Cityans with the promise of a rosy tomorrow, Brown went on to New York City to have the crank repaired and make arrangements for the construction of new wagons and for the organization of a steam wagon company. All interested parties, including Osborne, Sloat, and Lawrence, whom he left in Nebraska City, assumed he would return soon. In New York, Brown and Reed agreed to become equal partners in the planned steam wagon company. Their grand plan had everything but money. Essentially, Brown contributed an idea and Reed his mechanical know-how, but they needed to attract investors. Ultimately, the unwillingness of New York capitalists to fund what appeared to be a bizarre scheme doomed the construction of more steam wagons. Part of the steam wagon mythology includes the belief that Reed could not work on the wagons because of his wartime commitments to a defense contractor. There's also not much evidence in the Brown-Reed correspondence that supports that notion. Rather, Reed, for about a year after the Nebraska City trial, enthusiastically worked with Brown to raise capital in New York City and never mentioned his other work as a deterrent. Within a matter of days after reaching New York City, Brown realized that new, lighter wagons could not be rapidly funded and built. So he and Reed developed a contingency plan of first repairing the Nebraska wagon and then completely renovating the Minnesota wagon, and by driving it overland to Nebraska City by November 1st of 1862. As Reed started working on the new wheels, tank, and other parts for the Minnesota wagon, Brown left for home in the expectation that Reed would join him near Fort Ridgely to make the necessary alterations on Mazomanie, but his plans were soon dashed. As Brown was traveling by steamboat up the Mississippi toward St. Paul, he learned of the outbreak of an Indian war in Minnesota. On August 18, 1862, some of the reservation Dakota attacked the Lower Sioux Agency near present-day Redwood Falls. Brown's immediate concern was for the safety of his mixed-blood wife and children, who were living at his recently constructed stone house, Farther and Gay Castle, just across the Minnesota River from the Indian reservation. Hurrying home, he overtook the army that was advancing from Fort Snelling near St. Paul to Fort Ridgely. Brown was commissioned as a major in the force and added to the staff of its commander, Henry Hastings Sibley. Contrary to early reports of the deaths at hands of hostile Indians, Brown's wife and children were taken prisoners, but later rescued. Brown's new house, however, was destroyed. Brown subsequently served in the Minnesota campaign against the Indians and in 1863 participated in the Army's expedition into Dakota Territory. From active campaigning, he moved to the position of supervising the apprehension of fugitive Indians and organized a union of pro-white Dakota Scouts based at Fort Wadsworth in present-day northeastern South Dakota. After leaving the Army in 1866, Brown organized a trading company, Joseph R. Brown & Sons, based at Lake Traverse, Minnesota, which was renamed Brown's Valley in 1872 in his honor. While trading in association with some of his former Henderson partners, he extended his operations to places as distant as Devil's Lake in present-day northeastern North Dakota. Most of Brown's trade was with the Sisseton and Wahpeton bands of the Dakota, who generally had not participated in the Minnesota conflict. Brown, as their legal representative, was instrumental in negotiating the creation of a new reservation for them. For about a year after the Minnesota hostilities devastated his steam wagon scheme, Brown hoped to renew the venture despite his lack of funds and the failure to attract investors. Through Reed, Osborne, and Sloat, he received news from Nebraska City. In September 1862, Osborne, Sloat, and Lawrence, who had the wagon running again, thought Brown would soon rejoin them. Not only did Brown not return, but he was extremely tardy in corresponding with them and paying their monthly wages of $50 each, as well as their daily board bills of 50 cents each at the Seymour House. After frequent pleas from Osborne for money and instructions from Albert Tuxbury, the proprietor of Seymour House, he reluctantly met his obligations. Sloat left Nebraska City and returned to New York City sometime early in 1863, but Lawrence and Osborne stayed, firm in their conviction that they needed to continue to represent Brown's Nebraska interests. Osborne became involved with the trail improvement matter. Responding to the mass meeting's resolution, the Otoe County Commissioners authorized the sale of $2,500 worth of county bonds to improve the freighting road from Nebraska City to the western boundary of Otoe County, pending approval by voters in an election. After a legal technicality in publishing a timely notice precluded the road referendum from being placed on the ballot for a regular general election in the fall of 1862, the commissioners authorized a special election. Several months later, before the special election of December 29, 1862, the commissioners began officially to refer the route as the Steam Wagon Road and commissioned Frederick C. Morrison, an experienced surveyor, to lay out its course. Morrison completed his survey that fall. No tally of the special election is extant, but Otoe County's voters overwhelmingly approved the bond issue, which was funded by a special property tax of 1 mil per dollar of assessed valuation. In mid-March 1863, the county commissioners authorized Silas E. Smith, the Otoe County treasurer, to sell steam wagon road bonds. To raise the requisite $2,500, Smith sold 50 $50 bonds, which were redeemable at face value no later than January 1, 1870. Until they were redeemed, the bonds bore annual interest of 10% payable in $2.50 installments on the first day of January and July, beginning with July 1, 1863. When the commissioners approved issuing the bonds, they also appointed William E. Hill, a carpenter who had built a bridge over the Big Blue River on the Fort Kearny route in 1861, as road superintendent. Hill, assisted by Osborne, among others, promptly started trail improvement. By early May, his crew, which had nearly reached the western edge of the county, had built 6 bridges. As this work was being done, Osborne, evidently acting on Brown's orders, reconnoitered the freighting road west of Otoe County to the Big Blue River, with the aim of obtaining desirable timber and water sites for steam wagon stations. Trail improvement in Otoe County was only part of Brown's goal. He also wanted territorial support to better the road west of the county. Osborne closely monitored the prospects for legislative action, which was deferred until the lawmakers were convened in 1864. By a law approved on February 15th of 1864, the territory legislature named Hill, Osborne, and Anderson Davis of Seward County as commissioners to locate a territorial road westward from the western line of Otoe County to Walnut Creek in Seward County, where it would intersect an existing territorial road to Fort Kearny. The continuing presence and activities of Lawrence and Osborne seemed to assure Nebraska Cityans that Brown was on the verge of returning to resume his steam wagon expedition. When Brown's son, Samuel J., visited Nebraska City in May of 1863, while serving as an interpreter during the steamboat transfer of Dakota Indians from Minnesota to the Upper Missouri, he talked with either Osborne or Lawrence and also reported to his father that, quote, "The people of Nebraska City are anxious to know when you are going to make your appearance in this county," end quote. Some Nebraska Cityans presumed that Brown would bring 6 or more wagons when he returned. Although he certainly knew better, the younger Brown told people of Nebraska City that his father would probably be in Nebraska City by July or August. Because of their correspondence with Reed, Lawrence and Osborne knew that no new wagons were being built and that Brown would not soon return to Nebraska City. In disgust, Lawrence left Nebraska City in July of 1863 to return to his wife in New York. However, the 35-year-old Osborne, who opened a blacksmith shop, stayed and never returned to the East. He probably was chiefly responsible for the steam wagon's last hurrah. On July 4, 1864, it was fired up and run from Morton's farm to a downtown parade. It soon broke down again and was hauled back to Morton's place by horse. In the 1870s, while living in Ashland and Lincoln, Osborne displayed his mechanical ability by inventing a windmill and a railroad grader. As time passed, with no resumption of steam wagon activity, Brown lost most of his promotional value to Nebraska City. Even well before the December 2, 1863 announcement that Omaha had won the Union Pacific Prize, the local press had turned its attention from Brown to the Fort Kearny Trail, the one great thing that proved Nebraska City excelled over the hated Omaha. An enduring legacy evolved from trail advertising. In 1863, Nebraska City's newspapers, obviously influenced by aspiration rather than accomplishment, started heavily promoting the entire former Great Central Airline route to Fort Kearny as the Steam Wagon Road. The new name, illustrative of people's fascination with what had become their steam wagon, not only lasted to the end of overland freighting in 1866, but endures as the name of a Nebraska City street and the several miles of a county road leading from it to where the site of the wagon broke down. Despite two failures, Brown persisted in his dream that steam wagons could be significant in an increasingly technological society. While trading at Lake Traverse, he saw an opportunity to run wagons from a projected railroad terminus on the Bois de Sioux River northward through the Red River Valley to Winnipeg. In 1868, while initially contemplating this plan, he traveled to Nebraska City to inspect the abandoned wagon on Morton's farm. After the two men examined the badly rusted vehicle, Brown authorized Morton to sell it for him. Morton was never able to find a buyer, and finally, it was dismantled in 1899. While representing the Sisseton and Wahpeton in Washington, D.C. in 1869 and 1870, Brown was paying Reed to build his third wagon. Customarily short of money, Brown paid Reed in installments, and Reed worked on the project only after receiving a payment. Thus, Brown's hopes to have a wagon running in the Red River Valley by the fall of 1869 were not realized, and without a completed wagon, he could not attract investors to his proposed international steam wagon company. When Brown died suddenly in New York City on November 9, 1870, Reed and Brown's heirs were left with a partially completed steam wagon and some vivid memories of a dreamer and schemer who had continued to be an object of fascination in both Nebraska and Minnesota to the present day. Visitors to Nebraska City will soon notice the special niche the steam wagon has in the city's history and lore. Reminders of it abound. The prominently marked Steam Wagon Road is the most obvious. Since 1914, a stone marker commemorating the steam wagon's appearance has stood next to the now abandoned Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad Depot. And since 1929, the site where the steam wagon broke down on the Steam Wagon Road, 2.8 miles west of Arbor Lodge, has been marked by a metal tablet set in a large boulder. The erection of the second monument was inspired mainly by Edward S. Gregg, Nebraska City's leading promoter in perpetuating the steam wagon tradition. Gregg's interest in the steam wagon dated at least from 1891 when he obtained a cylinder from one of its engines from a Nebraska City foundry. As the proud owner of this relic, Gregg researched the wagon's history and came to be recognized as the local expert. The cylinder was passed on to Gregg's son Stanton, whose estate donated it to the Otoe County Historical Society in 1993. In 1951, artist Frank Zimmerer, a former Nebraska Citian, painted a steam wagon mural on its interior wall of the Nebraska City News Press building at 123 South 8th Street. The mural is still in place, but the site is now occupied by a coffee shop. Nebraska City's celebration of the steam wagon centennial in 1962 featured a reenactment of the steam wagons run by a restored steam tractor owner and driven by Lyman Knapp of Blackwell, Oklahoma. Naturally, Knapp's machine had a mock breakdown near the point of where the steam wagon had been forced to stop. Not surprisingly, outside of Nebraska City, the novelty of steam wagon attracted the attention of the press, the public, and the Nebraska State Historical Society. Publicity was particularly intense when the Nebraska City monuments were dedicated in 1914 and 1929. Then, another round of newspaper coverage was set off in 1932 by N.C. Abbott's chance discovery of a second steam wagon relic. After obtaining a 40-pound, 3-foot-long part of the front axle in Cass County, Abbott, a board member and former president of the Nebraska State Historical Society, donated it to the society. Clarence S. Payne and Addison E. Sheldon, while each were serving as the director of the Nebraska State Historical Society, collected steam wagon records. Payne was also instrumental in having the Nebraska City Depot marker erected, and Sheldon, in 1938, considered publishing a book on the steam wagon. In Minnesota, Brown's place in the state's history as a frontier celebrity is secure. Aspects of his career have been covered in all of Minnesota's general histories, and he remains the leading personage of Henderson's history. In 1910, the state of Minnesota, using legislatively appropriated funds, erected and dedicated a monument at Brown's grave in Henderson. In 1992, the Minnesota legislature designated the old Sibley County Courthouse in Henderson as the site of a proposed Joseph R. Brown Interpretive Center. The center was planned by the Joseph R. Brown Interpretive Center Task Force, which has been succeeded by the Joseph R. Brown Heritage Society. Currently, the society, with funding from the Legislative Commission on Minnesota Resources, a Minnesota State Bond Program grant, and the city of Henderson, is remodeling the courthouse. The society intends to exhibit a model of Brown's first steam wagon in the completed Interpretive Center. Without question, it was Brown's steam wagon experiments that distinguished him from his contemporaries and elevated his historical stature. Unusual things always command public attention. The country's rich tradition of mechanical inventiveness includes a fascination with quaint, unworkable devices and machines. Brown's colleagues respected him as an intelligent pragmatist, but they were openly skeptical of his steam wagon schemes. To them, he seemed to be uncharacteristically pursuing a bizarre notion of transporting freight with a motor vehicle in a roadless prairie wilderness. Hence, there was a certain natural tendency to laugh at him while marveling at his presumed ingenuity. The people who knew him best never fathomed his serious dedication to the steam wagon and never really understood his role. Thus, the history of Brown's steam wagon in Nebraska City contained an element of folklore from the start. During his Nebraska City appearance, at the time of his death, and in some later accounts, Brown was sometimes credited with having invented the steam wagon. Unfortunately, the myth of Brown as the steam wagon's inventor has also been reinforced by the inscriptions on the Nebraska City markers, which identify him as the wagon's owner and inventor. These erroneous designations naturally leave the impression that this Minnesota frontiersman, without benefit of mechanical training, was a genius far ahead of his time. But the historical record is clear. Brown was not an inventor, but a planner and a promoter, and his steam wagon was very much a creature of its day and certainly in keeping with the Civil War era technology. Thank you for listening to the Nebraska History Podcast. To learn more about Nebraska History Magazine, to listen to more podcast episodes, or to support our podcast by becoming a member of the Nebraska State Historical Society, go to history.nebraska.gov/podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and get notified when we release a new episode every other Thursday on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, I'm Chris Goforth.